Chapter 61. The ending of the date. 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. He swore that he was just following what she said. It was a serious, genuine question without any impure intentions hidden behind it. But did that matter? No. Chen Jinyao. Chen Jinyao. She dropped his hand, her face reverting back to its expressionless state. The ambiguity that had rose between them completely dissipated. Be open and honest, and everything will go smoothly in a good direction. This was something both Yan Cheng and Chen Jinyao believed in. But who would have thought that because of this incident, Chen Jinyao would end up changing her mind before the day was even over? The pair soon arrived at the Huaijing River, where signs of spring were already beginning to sprout from the surrounding banks. It wouldn't be long before the scenery became one of thriving green grass and flying warbles. It was 8 o'clock. At this time, the riverside was a world of lovers. Part of the reason was probably due to it being the weekend, since people were more likely to go out with their loved ones when they weren't busy working or studying. Although it would be an exaggeration to call it a crowd, the number of people at the river was enough to dissuade anyone from continuing down the path. This included Yan Cheng and Chen Jinyao, who turned around and headed down a different path. The street lamps were old-fashioned but classical, illuminating the night ever so slightly with their dim glow. There were less pedestrians walking along this path. A gust of wind drew a trail of leaves around their feet. Walking under the moon like this was, in a way, more romantic than watching the tide of the river. Yan Qing walked in front with Chen Jinyao behind him. She took off her scarf and asked him to bend down, playing the role of a considerate wife as she wrapped it around his neck. He lifted an eyebrow and reached out to rub her head. Then, just as he opened his mouth to praise her, she tightened the scarf. This scarf was good. She could hold on to him while he walked in front of her. Are you walking a dog? Yan Cheng had no expression on his face. Hearing this, Chen Jinyao suppressed her smile and deliberately teased him, "Tsk. I can't help it if that's what you think." He suddenly felt stifled. For the sake of keeping their marriage harmonious, he proposed that they forbid this exasperating sentence, "I can't help it if that's what you think," from being uttered again. Yan Cheng. Just be open and honest. Okay. Chen Jinyao naturally agreed. Then you can't say it either. Of course. Then, Yan Cheng stopped and narrowed his eyes in thought. As soon as he lifted his hand, he grabbed the scarf from the back and gave it a hard tug. Then, he turned around and opened his arms. Caught off guard, Chen Jinyao staggered from the force and fell straight forward, falling into his arms. Immediately, she was trapped. The sudden closeness made her eyes widen. The date has to have a perfect ending, the man said. Fortunately, she was good at concealing her emotions. After about 10 seconds, she successfully regained her composure and wrapped her arms around his waist. She lifted her hand with the intention of patting his waist, but instead, her palm fell on his behind. The waist and the buttocks were clearly so far apart from each other. Chen Jinyao. She buried her face in his chest. A few seconds later, she quietly raised her head and peeked at his reaction. As soon as she did, she was greeted by Yan Cheng's smiling countenance. A sense of embarrassment washed over her. The man raised an eyebrow and proceeded to tease her, shocking news. On this dark and windy night, near the Huaijiang River, a woman is caught openly molesting a handsome man. Chen Jinyao clenched her teeth and felt the urge to stand on her tiptoes and bite him. It was later confirmed that the handsome man was the woman's legal husband. Chen Jinyao. After thinking for a moment, Yan Cheng raised his head and whispered a few more words in her ear. And that was when he crossed her bottom line. She pushed him away, rolling her eyes as she did so, and snapped in a seemingly angered manner, "Take me to Guan." Her car was still parked there. She had work tomorrow and needed to drive back. Chapter 62. The commotion in Guan. 1. you are listening at Novel Full. Audio. Every night, Erguan boomed with business and was filled with music and laughter. Tonight was no exception. It was 9:30 p.m., the busiest and liveliest time of the day for the pavilion. Suddenly, a loud commotion erupted from one of the private rooms on the second floor. Erguan was, in essence, a bar. No matter what kind of approach was utilized to manage it, the fact that it was a bar would never change. At present, the performance stage on the first floor happened to be occupied by a group of rock singers. The sounds produced by their instruments alone were enough to reverberate through the entire building. Furthermore, the patrons were all either intoxicated or immersed in the music. It would not be far-fetched to say that the second floor existed in a parallel space of its own, isolated and independent from the first floor. Thus, the people on the second floor were not privy to the happenings on the first floor, and vice versa. Until the commotion reached the hallway outside the private room. The girl's scream was like the trigger to a pause button. Several people jumped off the dance floor and found a spot to watch the drama from. They stood on tiptoe and moved their bodies from side to side, anxious to see what was going on the second floor. This was the scene that greeted Yan Cheng and Chen Jinyao when they traveled across the city from the Huijing River to Erguan. They had planned to go home right after the date, but after remembering that he wasn't able to introduce Chen Jinyao as the lady boss thanks to her being drunk out of her mind last time, he turned the car around and drove to the pavilion. Of course, he never expected to encounter a scene like this upon their arrival. There was no shortage of spectators where there was drama to see. And most of the audience had the same hobby. Asking questions. What happened, what's the situation, and what happened to the waitress, came out in an endless stream of words. The gist of what had happened was not hard to figure out, yet they continued to act clueless and insisted on asking questions to validate their speculations. Yan Cheng stood near the entrance. His expression was calm and indifferent, but who knew what kind of storm was brewing in his dark eyes. However, one thing was for sure. The good mood from the date had been completely destroyed. Chen Jinyao stood to his right, trying to stay silent but firm at the same time, her hand gripping his tightly as though trying to pass all of the strength in her body to him. In truth, this kind of incident didn't faze Yan Cheng at all. He relaxed his eyebrows and pursed his lips slightly. Then, he waved at a passing waiter and asked if they knew what had happened. This waiter worked mainly on the first floor, so he was confused and shook his head at Yan Cheng's inquiry. Forget it. Yan Cheng sighed and took Chen Jinyao to the second floor. I don't feel worried at all, he said. She made a rare joke, it's probably because I'm holding on to you. Even as they were talking, Tai and manager Lin were already trying to mediate the situation. The situation wasn't anything uncommon or unpredictable. The scream had come from one of the part-timers at Erguan. Her main job was in alcohol advertising, otherwise known as being a beer girl. This was the highest paying job in Erguan because beer girls could make commission money from the alcohol they sold. Sometimes, the money they made in one night could top the amount of money others would make in the course of several nights. However, the high income came with high risk. To do this kind of marketing in a bar, the girl needed to wear less and have thicker skin than others. They must also be prepared and alert at all times to defend against sudden harassment from the guests. Chapter 63. The commotion in Erguan, 2. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. Only those who were able to accomplish those things could last long in this area, so it was fair that they would make more than those who worked in the other parts of the bar. The employee who had been harassed this time was a newcomer called Su Ran. She hadn't encountered any problems before today, when she met a man named Su Zhao. Su Zhao's family was a nouveau riche family, almost everyone knew him by this trait. He was proficient in eating, drinking, and fooling around, and most importantly, he was lecherous. Whenever someone caught his eye, he would choose to either make a ridiculing remark or take action directly. It wasn't enough for him to just touch her waist a few times, thus leading to the current situation. Su Ran had a strong personality and would rather be broken than humiliated. In order to protect herself, she took advantage of the crowd and deliberately caused a big scene. This was the proper type of response and courage a girl should have when facing harassment. From the perspective of most people, her actions were understandable and easy to sympathize with and support. And truthfully, she wasn't in the wrong. Su Zhao was not someone who would stand getting humiliated, so after being refuted on the spot, he refused to let Su Ran go. He made to hit her, not caring that she was a woman, and she'd fought back by hitting him on the head with a bottle of wine. Enraged, he had grabbed her by the hair, and the rest was history. When Su Zhao saw Yan Qing coming, he finally remembered something. In a sense, he was causing trouble in Yan Cheng's territory, but it was already too late to turn back now. After a few seconds, he controlled his expression and straightened his clothes. A whore wants to be shown respect. What a joke, he sneered. In the eyes of the patrons, beer girls were not the same as the normal employees. Su Ran was curled up at the side, sobbing continuously. After hearing the whole story, Yan Qing narrowed his eyes. He looked at Su Ran for a moment before turning to Su Zhao. "Young Master Su, would you give me some face and let this matter go? After all, she was only a part-time employee. If this continued to drag on, the reputation of Air Guan would be implicated. As its boss, he had to consider what was best for the staff and restaurant as a whole. The circle was big, but the world within it was small. He could not let one employee drag down the rest. Since Yan Qing had asked, Su Zhao naturally had to agree. The situation was already bad enough. Of course, how could I refuse to give young Master Yan face? However, you should properly discipline your employees." Su Ran heard him and swiftly raised her head. Her eyes were red-rimmed and still brimming with tears. She was the victim, so why was it her fault? Su Ran bit her lip and clenched her teeth. She wanted to defend herself and say, "It wasn't my fault," but in the end, she only said, "If he hadn't touched me, I wouldn't have hit him." Su Zhao's forehead was still bleeding, but it was not an undeserved injury. However, most of the time, the social reality was not so fair. Saving her from further entanglement with Su Zhao was already a very benevolent act. If she was expecting more, then Yan Cheng was not so kind of a person. He was neither a saint nor Buddha reincarnated. Ignoring Su Ran's words, he responded to Su Zhao. "Of course." And with that, the matter was settled. Of course, Su Ran was not satisfied. After the crowd broke up, everyone returned to their own games. Once again, loud music and ambiguity filled the air. Chen Jinniao dropped her gaze and stared at her pale fingers. She could imagine that her face was just as pale. Her entire person seemed to be frozen, and her mind was a mess. Long ago, before she became Chen Jinniao, she had a friend who often complained to her about the novels she read. Chapter 64. The Commotion in Air Guan, 3, you are listening at novelfull.audio. That friend's complaints had always gone in one ear and out the other, burying themselves deep into Chen Jinniao memories. If it weren't for the sudden incident that had happened today, Chen Jinniao wouldn't have realized that the strange world she had entered was actually the world inside of a novel. One of the stories her friend had told her about was a love story between a divorced bar owner and a little beer girl. They had their first encounter when she accidentally spilled red wine on him, and the second encounter was when he stood up for her when she got harassed. The man and his first wife had gotten together through an arranged marriage. His first love had married someone else, so in his despair, the heartbroken male lead agreed to the arranged marriage. However, what he didn't know was that his new wife was in love with the man his first love had married. All in all, it was a complicated relationship. Naturally, the story ended with a happily ever after for the two main leads. Chen Jinniao still remembered the name of the female lead in that story because her friend, who bore a similar name, had repeatedly emphasized it. The name was Su Ran. When all sorts of coincidences piled up, they could no longer be called coincidences. Chen Jinhao frowned, her expression indescribable. All of the blood was rushing back. If her suspicion was right, then she was one of the trivial female cannon fodders in the story. When Yen Cheng was almost done settling the matter, he turned around and noticed the expression on her face. Something was off about it. Frowning, he walked over and asked gently, "What's wrong?" Chen Jinhao looked at him in a daze. At the moment, her feelings were very complicated. After a while, she shook her head and said, "I'm okay." She pursed her lips, suppressing all the uneasiness welling up inside her. It was silent for a moment before he straightened his body and patted her head. Taking her hand, he intertwined their fingers and took her deep inside the crowd. When they returned to the site of the incident, he narrowed his eyes. After a few seconds, he turned to Manager Lin. "Fire her." Hearing this, Su Ran suddenly raised her voice. "I didn't do anything wrong. Why are you firing me?" Chen Jinhao tightened her grip on his hand and lowered her gaze. The look on Yen Cheng's face was indifferent, but his tone revealed that he was in no mood to argue with her. "I am the boss here. You didn't do anything wrong, but you are not suited to work in Air Guan, nor can we afford to keep you." "Why am I not suited? Based on what?" Su Ran retorted again. "Based on what happened today." Yen Cheng's patience was running out, and he said to her lazily, "You should have been prepared for something like this when you signed up to work at a bar, especially as a beer girl. If this happens again, it will damage the reputation of my restaurant, so you're saying it's my fault for wearing too little and getting harassed." Yen Cheng scrunched up his eyebrows. Though his explanation had been biased, this was not what he meant. "I came to Air Guan because I heard that the management here was good, but now that I've experienced it myself, I see that the rumors were exaggerated." Yen Cheng. "No matter how well Air Guan is managed, it is still a bar. Occurrences like the one you encountered today are inevitable. Are you expecting me to control the type of customers who come here too?" He was evidently annoyed. Standing from a different perspective meant he held a different position and opinion. "Again, you are not suitable to work in Air Guan. Plus, what are you trying to prove? If you wanted a part-time job this bad, you should have just stuck with being a home tutor." It was obvious that this woman had yet to experience the harsh reality of society and was naive to a terrifying degree. Without giving her a chance to speak again, he turned to Manager Lin. "Hurry and fire her, and pay more attention to who you hire from now on." Chapter 65. Anxiety and Unease. 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Su Ran was fired, there was no room for discussion. This was reality, where people who were willing to save a damsel in distress were a dime a dozen. When Manager Lin took her to settle her salary, the hard, angry look on Su Ran's face didn't go unnoticed by Yen Cheng. Anyone would feel aggrieved by this matter, but the grievance had been brought on by herself. She had no right to blame others for her own actions. Even if the situation had been 10 times worse, she would still have been expected to grit her teeth and bear with it. The bar was not a charity organization. Only those who could do their job right and not cause trouble for the establishment were qualified to stay. Manager Lin sighed deeply. He looked at the girl and tried to offer her a few words of comfort. Being righteous is not a bad thing, but you cannot survive in society by being righteous. But soon, he realized that she wasn't listening to him at all. Instead, she chose to capitalize on his sympathy, and it soon became obvious that she was looking for a common ally to complain to. As she ranted, she completely ignored her own fault and pushed all of the blame to the other party. "It wasn't my fault," and "why" nearly became her mantras. Manager Lin narrowed his eyes as the last bit of his patience slipped away. "On the first day of part-time employee training, I remember saying that those who don't think they can bear getting taken advantage of in exchange for some extra money should give up on the idea of becoming a beer girl. Why didn't you speak up then? Because she was naive. Human nature was a very complicated thing. Despite knowing that she was also at fault for causing the situation to escalate as much as it did, she continued to act like the complete victim when retelling the story to those who didn't know it. Since she was fired, Su Ran left Air Guan early. Not long after she exited the east door, she saw the owner of Air Guan, who had saved her and made her lose her job at the same time, leading a slender woman around the restaurant. She heard manager Lin call the woman the lady boss. From beginning to end, this lady boss could be considered a true spectator. Su Ran stared at them for a few seconds before turning away and heading for the bus stop. The night gradually deepened as a cool wind swept through the air and long shadows fell over the sidewalk. The city was still the same. Everyone was still going about their own lives. When she arrived at her university, she immediately returned to her dorm. Seeing her expression, her roommate asked her what was wrong. After some thought, Su Ran decided to leave out Air Guan and only talked about the harasser. As soon as she finished her story, their entire room seemed to be burning up from her roommate's anger. It's a good thing you were fired. Nothing terrible happened today, but that doesn't mean something worse wouldn't happen the next time. Su Ran nodded. Her roommate paused and said, I told you not to listen to my sister. If you want to earn pocket money, you should become a tutor. They can earn hundreds per lesson. The market price of tutors in the capital was very high. However, the parents were also very demanding. Teaching was easy, but preparations for the lesson plans that must be made before each class were a little cumbersome. Hearing this same piece of advice come out of her roommate's mouth made Su Ran pause, then she whispered, I know, but personally, she didn't want to be a tutor, even if it was just being a 1.1 tutor. She took out her notebook and carefully calculated her current savings, leaving aside the daily expenses for food and clothing. If she wanted to correct her teeth, she was still 5,000 short. It was quiet for a while. Her roommate turned around and said, by the way, Ran, how was the dental clinic recommended by Ji Xiao? I think my boyfriend has a cavity. He keeps hissing in pain and holding his left cheek. I don't know yet. I haven't been there. Su Ran shook her head. Her roommate was rendered speechless for a few moments. Forget it, I'll just ask Ji Xiao. With Su Ran's appearance, Chen Jinyao felt like a ticking bomb had been placed in her hands. She didn't know when this bomb would suddenly explode and blow her to pieces, so she kept thinking and thinking, hoping to come up with something that could soothe her mind. For example, maybe she was just overthinking. Maybe this wasn't the world of a novel. Maybe everything was just one huge coincidence. Self-deception was also a form of self-comfort. But in any case, it would be difficult for her to back out of this marriage now. Chapter 66. Anxiety and Unease, 2, you are listening at novelfull.audio. The one who said they should slowly nurture their feelings was her, and now the one who wanted to shrink back into her turtle shell was also her. Normally, she would be willing to bet everything in a single throw even if the outcome was uncertain, but if this really was a world inside a novel, then that meant the plot and ending had already been predetermined by the author. How could she continue to rush forward without hesitation, knowing that she was helpless to how things would develop? Chen Jinyao felt very pessimistic. For a split second, knowing that she was fighting against the fate of this world, she considered giving up. She should find an opportunity to end her relationship with Yan Cheng. But then again, she was really surprised by the scene she had witnessed. The original female lead's personality was completely unexpected. Thinking about this, her gaze toward Yan Cheng became complicated. Before she could recollect herself, he turned his head and looked at her, and in that instance, the feelings in her heart became even more complicated. After all, despite her speculations, Yan Cheng's situation was still relatively stable. Moreover, he was trying his best to be a good husband to her. April came quietly. Winter had departed, and all that was left was to wait for a spring breeze to sweep through the city. Spring in the capital was always a great spectacle. The most characteristic of its coming was the light, continuous rain that would drive the dirt on the surface of the city into the sewers, washing the world anew. It was the weekend. Chen Jinniao left her desk and hugged Dunyi to her chest as she leaned against the balcony. She took a deep breath of the fresh air and admired the vibrant scenery below the apartment. Immediately, she felt as though the fatigue in her eyes had been relieved. Behind her, inside of the apartment, Yan Cheng was leaning against the dining table while drinking from a teacup. His eyebrows were furrowed. After taking a sip of tea, he lifted his head and stared at Chen Jinniao. Recently, he had noticed that there was something off about her. Something very off. He was an observant person, and he could tell that something about Chen Jinniao had changed. He couldn't put his finger on what exactly it was that had changed, but he sensed an inexplicable sense of distance between them that wasn't there before. The rain stopped, and the sun parted the clouds. Sunlight refracted through the glass, casting a golden afterglow. Yan Qing quietly rested his right cheek against his hand, trying and failing to remember if he had offended her somehow. There was no other reason she would suddenly turn cold, right? A few seconds later, the man put down his teacup, took a deep breath, and walked over in his slippers. They'd agreed to be open and honest with each other. He'd already reflected on himself and still couldn't find an answer, so he decided to just ask her directly. As he approached, Dunyi meowed and tried to jump down from Chen Jinniao's arms. She stroked its head a few times, but it continued to act restless, so she had no choice but to put it down. As soon as its limbs touched the ground, it swung its tail and scurried onto the sofa in the living room. Chen Jinniao didn't think much of it, but just when she was about to turn around and see what Dunyi was doing, Yan Qing embraced her from behind. Before she could react, he buried his face in her neck and said, "You've been acting strange lately." After a momentary pause, he stretched out his hand and gently pinched her chin, turning her face so she was forced to look at him. "Did I offend you somehow?" Chen Jinniao felt trapped in his deep, sincere gaze. How was she supposed to answer? Should she come up with a false charge? But he hadn't done anything wrong. It would make her feel ridiculous and guilty if she charged him with something he'd never done. At the same time, she couldn't just ignore his question. No, she shook her head. You didn't do anything wrong. Then, she added, the problem lies with me. It was her who kept letting her thoughts run wild and affect how she interacted with him. Yan Qing frowned in confusion. It was quiet for a while. Chen Jinniao patted Yan Cheng's hand, turned her head, and looked into the distance. Hey, I have a hypothetical question. If you go out tomorrow and suddenly fall in love with a girl outside, what would you do? Admittedly, this question was a little tricky. Instead of an answer, she heard Yan Qing say, that question is meaningless. Chen Jinniao pursed her lips and didn't respond. After all, he was right. Most hypothetical questions were meaningless. Plus, that question makes me seem like a dog, he added blankly. At that, she couldn't help but smile and ask teasingly, what? He made a tisk sound. A poodle. Ha ha ha. It was amazing. Just a few words of conversation had wiped out the gloominess that was suffocating her. Just then, her phone beeped with a WeChat message notification from Student Ji Xiao. Student Ji Xiao. Sister Chen, I have a question. For the teeth correction procedure, can I pay in installments? Student Ji Xiao. I forgot to ask you last time. My classmate reminded me today. A few seconds later, Chen Jinniao replied. Yes, you can. Chapter 67. Fever, 1, you are listening at novelfull.audio. After a few days, the city ushered in a cold spring. The temperature dropped so drastically that it caught everyone off guard. The day before was full of sunshine and the temperature was pleasant. Many busy parents had planned to take their family for an outing over the weekend, but now their plans were ruined. When they woke up early in the morning, they could easily sense that the temperature had dropped sharply. The difference was difficult to adapt to. In the afternoon, the sky outside was gloomy, and then suddenly there was a strong wind and heavy rain pouring down. This psycho weather will probably last for several days. In the clinic, Xiao Lu stood behind the front desk and looked at the rain running down the glass door. He cupped his face in his hands and grumbled. Little did he know that it would become the truth. The rain was not continuous, but intermittent. The weather fluctuated between good and bad, and the temperature jumped around from high to low. Under this vicious cycle, a large scale flu attack swept through the capital. Strictly speaking, it was not just in the capital. Every part of the country experienced influenza virus attacks during this time period every year. But as long as it was not a new type A/H1N1 similar to the one from the past, they were fine. This time, Chen Jinhao was unfortunately caught. She'd got a little rain on herself when she left work on Friday. At first, she'd felt nothing, but on Saturday, the terrible symptoms appeared. She was awakened by Yan Cheng. When she slowly opened her tired eyes, the first thing she saw was his handsome face in close proximity with hers. The man frowned, his face expressionless. "You're all sweaty." It was still early in the morning, so his voice was a little husky. He touched her forehead and felt the burning temperature against the back of his hand. At this, he became even more expressionless. "You have a fever, get up quickly and let's go to the hospital," he said. There were actually fever and cold medicines at home, but he didn't trust them to work when her temperature was this high. Chen Jinhao was unresponsive. Yan Qing scrunched up his nose, patted her face, and said again, "Did you hear me? Get up, I'm taking you to the hospital." "Is she half-conscious from the fever?" he murmured to himself. Chen Jinhao groaned. Her head felt like it had been stuffed full with cotton, and she couldn't concentrate at all on what he was saying. Her eyelids drooped, threatening to close again. She just wanted to sleep. She wanted to burrow under the blanket and return to the comfort of the darkness, subconsciously believing that when she woke up, she would be fine again. The expressionless man who woke her up was so annoying. "I'll be fine after some more sleep." Due to the fever, Chen Jinyao's whole body was soft and weak, and even the way she spoke carried a touch of coquettishness. "I'll be fine after I sleep and sweat it out." "Really?" Yan Qing narrowed his eyes and pondered for a moment. His expression was slightly disapproving, but before he could say no, she suddenly launched an attack that hit him straight in the heartstrings. He never expected her to have this side to her. She had leaned into his body and wrapped her arms around his waist. He cooperated, letting her drill into his arms and rub her face against his chest. "Really, I don't need to go to the hospital." There was not one bit of her usual toughness in sight. She was like a little girl begging for sweets now, which meant, she needed to be coaxed. Yan Qing came to this conclusion after observing and personally experiencing it. This could be considered a sugar-coated bullet. The man lowered his gaze and laughed helplessly. He tried his best to be cruel, to break free from her hug, but the more he struggled, the tighter he was restrained. In the end, he temporarily compromised and patted her on the back, feigning surrender. "Oh, I get it. Are you scared of the hospital?" After a pause, he decided to provoke her. "Coward. I just want to sleep, I'm not afraid of the hospital," she retorted confidently. The provocation method proved ineffective against her. He was completely at a loss. If he were more strong-willed, he would have directly picked her up from the bed, wiped her down and changed her clothes, and then carried her to the car before driving to the hospital. "Okay, you can sleep, but you have to go to the hospital when you wake up." Chen Jinhao immediately became obedient and nodded several times. Yan Cheng. For a moment. He felt that he had been tricked. Thoroughly tricked. I'll let you off since you have a fever. He gently poked her forehead with his index finger as he clucked his tongue. After about 2 minutes, the soft-hearted Yan Qing sighed. Before she fell asleep again, he woke her up and told her to wait as he boiled some water and fed her a pill. She was wrapped like a burrito in her blanket, her forehead damp with sweat and her cheeks flushed from the heat. She blinked, her eyes still glossy with tears, and stared at him for a long time without speaking. Then, she said seriously, "Okay." Chapter 68. Fever, 2, you are listening at novelfull.audio. It was admittedly very cute. The shadows of the trees outside swayed from side to side, and when the relentless raindrops were caught by the fierce wind, they immediately changed directions and splattered against the windows. This was really a morning of torment. Yan Qing left the bedroom as though he was running away. When he returned from the kitchen, he had calmed down a lot. Not only was he able to restore usual lazy attitude, he could even change his expressions to something other than its usual indifference. He ridiculed Chen Jinyao with a smile that wasn't a smile, "You're cuter when you're drunk or burning up from a fever, you know." The usual Chen Jinyao was too, how should he put it? Rational. She was always trying to keep a safe distance between herself and other people. Of course, he could sense that she was trying to slowly close the distance between them these days, but the progress was moving at a snail's pace. However, whenever she became drunk or feverish, she was like an open book. Yan Qing watched as she drank the water. He hoped that, like she said, the fever would be gone after she had some medicine and sweated it out. Alas, he was careless. Chen Jinyao suddenly raised her head and stared at the white, round pill on his palm. She was silent for a few seconds, seemingly thinking about what he had said. Afterward, she fell into deep thought. 10 seconds later, she lifted her head and looked at him again. She tilted her head to the side. Yan Qing watched in confusion as she slowly lifted her hand from the bed and positioned it level with her eyebrows. Like a lucky cat, she fisted her hand and bent her wrist, then straightened it again. After doing this 3 or 4 times, she opened her mouth and said, "Meow." Yan Qing was stunned. In this moment, the first thought that came to his mind was not, "Fuck, I'm going to explode from the cuteness," or "I married such a lovely wife, my ancestors' graves must be quaking with jealousy," and whatnot. Thankfully, he had not reached that stage of craziness. Instead, he said, "Fuck, did you really become stupid from the fever?" Chen Jinyao thought for a moment and nodded. No, I shouldn't have listened to you. Stop sleeping, I'm taking you to the hospital right now. You need to get an 4 drip. If you're sleepy, you can sleep after we reach the hospital. There should be beds there." After so long, Chen Jinyao's mind had become somewhat clear again. She frowned, shook her head, and said, "How can I call for a nurse if I fall asleep while an 4 is in my arm?" For a second, he was utterly confused. She explained, "Like when the 4 runs out. I'll guard you." Yan Qing narrowed his eyes, trying to be patient. Unexpectedly, she shook her head and refused him, "No, you are not reliable." How should she describe her current mood? After the 4 drip was finished, Chen Jinyao became sober. Staring at the back of her injected hand for a few seconds, she slowly retracted her gaze and turned her face to look at Yan Qing, who was sitting to the side with one hand in his pocket and the other holding his phone. He was watching something on it. She leaned over for a peek. It was the news. Yan Qing had taken her to the closest hospital. When they arrived, there were a lot of patients suffering from almost the same symptoms as her. They came and went, got an 4 and left, until finally, it was her turn. "They should have put you in a ward. It's so noisy here." Yan Qing frowned. People tended to become very emotionally dependent when they were sick. Chen Jinyao did not say a word, but her gaze was firm. Today, Yan Qing seemed to be 2.8 meters tall, which was very reassuring. Her little heart felt like it was flying. Of course, compared to, "this man is very reliable," and other random thoughts like this, the most urgent thing in her mind was how frequently she wanted to urinate. "I want to go to the toilet," she complained. Hearing this, Yen Cheng put away his phone, got up, and pulled the 4 out for her. He seemed to be a good man. The patient next to them cast him an admiring look. At this moment, she also thought that Yen Cheng was a good man. At the same time, she openly accepted the envy, jealousy, and hatred of others. He accompanied her to the entrance of the restrooms. In public, there were differences between men and women, so she could only rely on herself for the rest. After using the restroom, they walked back. Yen Cheng said, "You need to exercise more to boost your immunity." Yen Cheng. "Look at me, I exercise every day. Look at how healthy my body is." Chen Jinyao retracted her previous statement about this shameless man being reliable. The next evening, Chen Jinyao watched as the nurse patted Yen Cheng's clenched fist and carefully inserted the tiny needle into his arm. She tried to suppress it, but after a few seconds, she burst out laughing. "Chen Jinyao. I have a joke. Chen Jinyao. Your body is very healthy." Yen Cheng. Chapter 69. Family Should Not Fight. 1. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. This year's flu season lasted longer than before. Countless people were caught by its unpredictability, and as a result, a steady stream of patients flooded the hospitals and small clinics every day. It was the season of 4 drips. The nurses and doctors were practically flying on their feet as they scrambled from patient to patient. Facts proved that people should be careful about what they boasted about. Even if they were confident in what they said, they should still maintain a proper degree of humility, because they'd never know when it might come back and bite them in the ass, turning them into a laughing stock. Of course, Yen Cheng had been infected by Chen Jinyao. They didn't really do anything, but he was worried that she would kick the blanket in her sleep and thus refuse to listen to her when she told him to move to the guest room. After holding her feverish body and her restless legs close for an entire night, he died gloriously in battle. Alas, his sacrifice didn't earn him her sympathy. He received mockery instead. After the needle was slowly pushed into his arm, Yen Cheng loosened his fist. When his cool gaze swept over in her direction, she promptly withdrew the mocking smile on her face. Although they weren't truly a couple, the pretenses should still be kept up. Yen Cheng pursed his lips and said blankly, as the poet Kai Ji once said, "Family should not fight each other." He paused, "You should take it into consideration." Chen Jinyao stared at him with one eyebrow raised and drawled, "Okay." Ignoring the obvious insincerity in her tone, the man nodded slightly and continued to advise her, "Killing each other will only result in destruction to both sides." Chen Jinyao. The first thought that came to mind when she heard this was, bullshit. The reality was very different from whatever he was preaching. However, she chose wisely to keep silent and pretend to surrender, agreeing with his words while secretly laughing at him. He could obviously tell what she was thinking, but what he didn't understand was what she found so amusing. Sighing, he decided to ignore her. Things stayed this way until the 5th day. When the two of them were finally released from the hospital, Chen Jinyao couldn't laugh anymore. As a matter of fact, she wanted to cry. It was like eating the same food every day until a subconscious aversion toward it was developed, and the person would not want to eat it again until a long time has passed. Unfortunately, they had had no choice. Although the fever was gone, their bodies still felt tired and sluggish from the sequelae of the virus. Of course, they were recovering quickly, but the hospital had advised them to stay for a few more days as a precaution. This last day was the 5th day, and they felt like they had been reborn. "I haven't been inside the hospital for this long in my entire life," Yen Cheng remarked in an almost accusatory tone. Evidently, he was also exhausted. Chen Jinyao answered without thinking, "Impossible." Hearing this, he frowned and looked at her with a serious gaze. His expression was filled with discontent. "Who knows how many nights you slept in the incubator in the hospital when you were born," she said indifferently. "That doesn't count," he retorted. However, these 3 words were doomed to be refuted. They stood there with their heads close together, arguing in hushed tones. In the eyes of the nurse, this looked like unabashed flirting. They had been rubbing dog food in her face for the past several days now. She handed them 2 thermometers and remarked with a smile, "You two have such a good relationship." Hearing this, Chen Jinhao was stunned. She looked down and said nothing except for a single "hmm." What was she supposed to say? Should she just smile and nod? While she was fretting over how to respond, Yan Cheng answered in a husky voice, "Yes, we are newlyweds." They had been married for half a year already. How could they still be considered newlyweds? She glanced at him from the corner of her eye and suddenly found herself caught by his gaze. He was smiling with a happy expression on his face. In her shock, she forgot to look away. Chapter 70. Family Should Not Fight. 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Her face was a little hot, and her ears seemed to be heating up. In the eyes of outsiders, this looked like something affectionate. The nurse appeared to be very envious of this good-looking couple. How wonderful! Chen Jinhao pursed her lips, withdrew her gaze, and quietly ducked her head. A few seconds later, she raised his leg and kicked Yan Cheng. "Humph." The confused Yan Cheng leaned down and whispered, "Are you feeling shy?" Hiss, she kicked him again. That was when he realized it. She was infuriated. The rare frustrated expression on her face made him raise his eyebrows and turn away after staring at her for a few seconds. A surge of indescribable emotions attacked his heart, and when he finally recovered from it, he laughed. The light overhead cast a soft glow on their faces. The sound of their heartbeats was especially loud in the quiet room. It was spring, and even the air was filled with a sweet fragrance. Faint and silent. This was probably the taste of love. After they recovered from the flu, the sky cleared up. Everything seemed bright and hopeful. It was the sun after the rain. For a period of time before this, Yan Cheng could sense that Chen Jinyao's inexplicable sense of distance and unease was due to him. After confronting her about it, he learned that he had been charged with a nonsensical offense. Hypothetically falling in love at first sight with someone else. He had never felt so wronged before. However, it was probably because he didn't give her enough attention. The problem needed to be solved at the root. Fortunately, their childish banter and the time they spent together at the hospital had greatly eliminated her inner anxiety and closed the distance between them. Another reason was that they didn't bump into the suspected female lead, Su Ran, again after the encounter at Erguan, which comforted Chen Jinhao and allowed her to believe that maybe everything was just a coincidence after all. Marrying Yan Cheng had been a gamble, and so far, she believed that she had been right to make this gamble. Now, she was ready to make her second gamble and put her faith in the saying, familiarity breeds fondness. At least, she knew she would be reluctant if she had to let Yan Cheng go now. But it always felt like she was being pulled and dragged along. These were the thoughts she used to deceive herself and hide her unease. Hidden in a place that she thought was safe, yet prone to explode at any given moment. After that, life passed as usual. It was sunny on Saturday. Chen Jinhao opened every window in the apartment and instructed Yan Cheng to put the blankets out on the balcony to dry. Any remaining traces of the virus must be aired out. If we put the blankets out to dry, it'll be too hot to use when we need to sleep, he said while putting on his slippers. Chen Jinhao was silent for a moment. He was right. The weather had continued to fluctuate. After the flu season passed, a sweltering heat enveloped the city without so much a warning. Chen Jinhao. Let's put it up after it's dry and use a thinner blanket. After saying that, she pointed in a specific direction. It should be in the second cabinet in that room. After you find it, go and lay it out on the master bed. Yen Cheng looked in the direction she was pointing and nodded. This kind of simple, mundane life had become their norm. It was boring but at the same time comforting, and somewhat magical. Of course, that didn't mean they spent their days like Buddhist monks. Sometimes when the mood was right, it would only take one glance for sparks to start flying. Yen Cheng would either press Chen Jingyao down on the sofa or make her straddle his lap before carefully claiming her lips and giving in to his desires. When they separated, panting and sweaty, Yen Cheng would gently nuzzle her cheek with his nose. Today was no different. After 7 or 8 minutes, once he had calmed down, he asked, "Wife, do you think we're passionately in love right now?" "I think so," she replied without thinking. Early May. The student recommended by one of her regular patients arrived at the clinic. Chen Jingyao never thought this student would be Su Ran. Su Ran. "Hello, Dr. Chen. I'm here for a dental appointment." After a few seconds, Chen Jingyao managed to squeeze out a curt, "Hello." Then, Su Ran exclaimed, "Hey, I remember you." Chen Jingyao was barely able to maintain her professional smile. This fated meeting brought about by the female lead's protagonist Halo almost smashed her usual calm expression to pieces.